Logic is part of our makeup as human creatures. And so it's fair to say that whatever we believe should make sense. So in one way, we need to, at some stage, examine the fact that the range of doctrines and the way we proclaim the gospel fits together and makes sense. But what I want to do this afternoon is put that against current thinking, or recent thinking, shall we say. Our world has a particular approach to so many things. And this, from 1 Corinthians 13, is not really what you find in the world. Love, suffering long, being kind, no envy, not showing off, not puffed up, not behaving rudely. Well, I could go on. But that is the principle that the Apostle Paul is proclaiming there in terms of the love that is God's and should be taken on board by his children. That's not what you find a lot of in our world, sadly. What we do find, however, around us is, to various extents in various cultures and countries and societies, and within various groups within those, a spectrum of acceptance of God to outright rejection of God, and the very thought of it, which makes some people laugh and sneer. Now, it's no way to start to convince somebody who's at that extreme. But let me bring to you some words through the prophet Ezekiel in his 9th chapter. And this is talking, sadly, of the way in which God's chosen people, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, had both gone astray. And we're told there that their iniquity was great, that the land is full of bloodshed, and the city is full of perversity. But the point that we want to come to is the fact of the reason given for that departure from God. What is it that persuaded people whose history was full of God's interaction with them, and indeed, as we said this morning, his care for them, even in their extreme afflictions? What was it that turned their minds? People found that the city they lived in, the city of Jerusalem, was full of this attitude, and I quote, "The Lord has forsaken the land, and the Lord does not see." So God's gone. He doesn't see. And obviously, if he's not around, if he's not seeing, he doesn't care. And that's what led the people to such an extreme position. They had rejected the fact there might be a God active in their midst. Now, it's many years since I first tackled this and proposed this thought in one other talk. Has God, if, as we will see, created this universe and this world and this human creation only to go off and leave it to its own devices? Is that the sort of God we're talking about? Who's done something and quite uncaringly has gone off and left it? So even if you accept there's a God, is he still involved? Or, as the extreme has said, and when I was a young man, going back to those days again, there was, of course, the book published entitled God is Dead. Or, more generally, there has been a movement dedicated to the thought that there is no God. And we know one or two high-profile exponents of that have made an impact on society in recent years. And that is the problem, that so many people think that either God, if you choose to believe in some sort of divine being, is not that relevant, not that concerned, or in fact that there is no God, and that these people who believe in him are deluded. Now, my stance this afternoon is that actually the logic of discussing these things, and indeed of answering the points that are made by certain people, is actually the good basis, a very good basis for answering and getting the answer right. Now, there are, of course, various people saying various things about our world and our universe, indeed. One of those things, of course, is the question of, are we alone in this universe? And it's probably fair to say that some people are absolutely obsessed with that particular issue. Then there are others who are concerned with whether the world will survive. And we have a number of sources who weigh in on this particular issue. Apart from the environmental movement, there are, of course, serious scientific concerns about the state of the world. Not just environment, but also man's impact. And so just less than 3 months ago, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists published its 2024 announcement that its famous Doomsday Clock was being left at 90 seconds to midnight because it was concerned that nuclear threat in Russia's war on Ukraine, the last 6 months of war affecting Israel, as well as the climate-related disasters and various other things, were keeping the world at that dangerous point where the apocalypse was only a minute and a half away, in their terms. The risks from last year, they said, continue with unabated veracity and continue to shape this year. They are absolutely convinced of the truth of their analysis. And meanwhile, as I say, other scientists are searching for life. And recently there's been some excitement, of course. A capsule carrying a precious cargo of a handful of dust grabbed from an asteroid to be analysed has led them to say things like, this promises to inform the most profound of questions. Where do we come from? It may be that when we get this back to Earth, we'll be looking at material that existed before our planet. We may be even seeing some grains that existed before our solar system. We're trying to piece together our beginnings. How did the Earth form? Etc., etc., etc. And they are concerned that this may be the way in which they can analyse and prove what happened in the long distant past when Earth came into being. And then of the search for alien life, we live in an infinite universe, and so it's only a matter of time. There are infinite stars and planets, and it's been obvious to many of us that we can't be the only intelligent life out there. Well, of course that's true, but the ultimate intelligent life is the God whose plan that we are privileged to proclaim from this platform and around the world. So here we have the moment that the Doomsday Clock was unveiled this year, showing it at 90 seconds to midnight, and apocalypse is as close as it's ever been. And with the increasing tension in the world, you might think, well, yeah, they've got a point. What will happen? Will the Earth be destroyed? So where does logic come into this question? let's just take a step backwards, although still with scientific endeavour, and let's reboot our thinking. I have another picture here. Maybe some of you have seen this relatively recently issued second-class stamp. If not, let me advise you what it is. It is a picture of Luke Howard, who in 1803, that's a long time ago, who in 1803 was a pioneer meteorologist. That's the point. This set of stamps, of course, was celebrating the work of meteorologists in the last 200 and how many years, right through from this man classifying clouds in 1803 to the supercomputers that are used in weather forecasting today. Now, what is the significance of Mr. Howard's work? It's actually contained in that simple word. That it's actually there on the stamp. What did he do? He classified clouds. So clouds are not just random things. They can be classified. The very fact they can be classified means there is order on our planet. And we know that that extends to the rest of the universe, although recently various things have happened. Some observations from telescopes. James Webb Telescope was just working in time to capture an unusually bright, in fact, the brightest flash of light ever recorded. Oops, it doesn't quite fit in with current theories. They're struggling to understand it. But the simple fact is that Mr. Howard could classify clouds in 1803. He could look, he could observe, he could produce a classification. It is a logical and structured universe we live in. Of course, then, these critics of the concept of a God with order, and my premise this afternoon that this God is a logical being who has given us a perfectly logical and wonderful set of facts and beliefs to hang on to. This is, of course, held up against the great scientists of later in the 19th century and other times. And yet, you see, what they don't particularly trumpet is this quote from Charles Darwin, who wrote of the impossibility of conceiving this immense and wonderful universe, including man, with his capability of looking far backwards and far into the future. Now, you might notice in your strolls in the countryside or in your garden behavior from wildlife that suggests that they learn from things somehow. Maybe from their parents, maybe from their circumstances. But I don't think any other creature can possibly be described in this way. We can look far backwards and far into the future. We have a brain, a capacity for reason that puts us in that category. And Darwin says that could not be as the result of blind chance or of necessity, which is one of the other arguments they use. And so Darwin admitted that when thus reflecting, quote, I feel compelled to look to a first cause. Now, I'm not sure it's generally known, but in the latter part of the previous century, up to I think about the 1930s, the whole discussion among scientists around this and the fact of how did it all happen, they came to the point of using a phrase which eventually was superseded by Fred Hoyle's sneering use of the term Big Bang, which is completely unreasonable. What was that start of things meant? What was it called? They called it the creation point. And even now, you will find even people like Attenborough occasionally slipping in words that clearly refer to this concept. that things have come from an ordered mind, a creation, whatever. Now, we are not here to particularly consider the human words of this or that person of recent centuries. But what we do need to do, my dear brothers and sisters and friends, is to take account of the fact that however loud the scientific case against God is trumpeted, it does not hold up. And then you come to some more other arguments, some of a theological nature, some of a more scientific nature. And again, what one comes to the fact that the movement amongst Western atheists against God was dealt a stunning reversal for a time, although they're back with a vengeance, as you might have noticed, when the man who wrote what was considered at the time the leading treatise, a little pamphlet about this matter, changed his mind. Anthony Flew had written a tract called There Is No God. But then he changed his mind. And he wrote another. And I don't know if you can see this, but on this cover of his book, of his second book, the word no God is scribbled out, and he's handwritten in a word a God. So now this book says, there is a God. And the subtitle is How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. Now, I'm not particularly concerned in terms of what Flew says or why he changed his mind. The fact is that there were very compelling reasons for him to write a different narrative. And therefore, we are faced with a choice. Which version of events are we happy with? And to me, one of the compelling things about this is not so much his own conclusion, which we'll come to in a moment, but also the sources, the well-respected, many respected sources that he drew on to make the point. And this argument about the cause and the universe has rattled on and still attracts a lot of attention. But in the book, Flew quotes one man, and this is this eminent person's conclusion. And just think about the logic here. As I say, we are logical beings, and we should therefore be able to assess something that is put before us. This other person said, it is very unlikely that a universe would exist without a cause, and hence the acceptance that there must have been a reason, a start, a cause. It's very unlikely that it could have just been a random chance in nothingness. But what was more likely? It's rather more likely that God would exist without a cause. You don't need a reason, a start to God, and that he could then start a universe with its logic and compelling complexity that works. That is far more likely. And so Flew, when he changed his mind, writes this: the only satisfactory explanation for the origin of such, what we've just been talking about, this life we see on earth, is an infinitely intelligent mind. An infinitely intelligent mind. Now, this, of course, is what the Bible shows us. A God who created things. And of course, the classic place to start is at the beginning. In the beginning, the beginning. You see, the very first words of the Bible chime with this point, that there had to be a beginning. But what was, in the beginning, God. And God created the heavens and the earth. Now, if you're interested in the science of this, then if you speak to Brother John Thorpe, who lives in Manchester but is a member of Liverpool City Ecclesia, he has produced, in fact, I've probably got a copy on my phone, a 50-page document covering this whole question of the Big Bang and all these other things, and some quite, well, even beyond me, bits of physics that make me thankful I went in other directions than trying to go into the detail of physics. But God started things. And I can remember as a young man, before my baptism, being confronted by the point that what we then find is logical. So people suggesting that this ancient record, they've got to acknowledge it's very ancient. Whether it was written down by Moses or not, they may quibble, but this ancient record, how could Moses have written down something that would then make sense in terms of its sequence, complexity, and connections, all these millennia later in scientific and logical terms? Was that a fluke? I've not even tried to put probabilities on some of the things that he would have to get right by guesswork and work out what the probability would be. But it is ludicrously out of any sensible analysis to think that Moses will get it right by chance. Particularly, of course, when you compare what the Bible says to other ancient civilizations' view of creation, involving strange doings amongst the gods, involving an elephant, whatever. This is simple and straightforward. It fits both in terms of its breadth and its expression, but also it fits in that nesting, logical, necessary connections way that I spoke of. And that is the very first part of the Bible. Now, having got that solid basis, we then see history unfolding. And sadly, the one thing the Bible is good at is explaining why the earth is now in the mess it is. Why it is that we have the most advanced society, probably, although I think people have underestimated what the advancement in society was before the flood of Noah. But even now, we clearly must have the most advanced society with capabilities that our grandparents would not have been able to realize or think about. When I started my professional career, and my head department at the college brought us the first computer, which would be for use in a student-facing role, we had to load little programs from cassettes onto a machine that would be embarrassed if it were a thinking being by the level of downloads we have to update our apps on our smartphones. And that's just in these last 50 or so years. But the logic of the Bible is contained in all these words and has been so for so many millennia. Yes, man has made phenomenal progress in scientific and in other ways, and it's had its impact on life. but the world is still in a mess. So much of scientific advancement is, of course, driven by the need for such in military terms. Computers, so many other things, so much of the space program. All to do with the ability to be top dog, to destroy, to defend. And the scriptures explain clearly why it is that this is so. So the doctrine of sin and death is not just some theological item that you can pass by or preferably agree with us on. It is something that explains the world today. And the terrible jealousy and hatred and confusion that plague our corridors of power around the world and their relations, they just chime exactly with what the Bible says about man's inability to follow God's ways, to live in peace, and particularly to follow the ways of God's wisdom. See, there's another concept that people around us probably are unhappy with. Wisdom. God's wisdom. And yes, as I say, this will completely infuse the whole of the Bible teaching that we proclaim around the world as well as from this platform. Now, on that basis, we then see that God provides a solution. So it's not just that God created something that can be understood, analyzed, and logically explained to an extent, but still wondered at. And then things went wrong. But God knew what the solution was in advance, so that only a few relatively verses after that record of creation, there was that first hint of a solution to the problem of sin and death, right back in Genesis chapter 3. And there was more than a hint then, as things expanded, of the way this was going to happen. My Bible is open later in the book of Genesis, in the life of Abraham, a man who had received promises from God. Now, even that is unthinkable to so many people, that this God, even if they would accept, for the sake of argument, that there is a God, they would struggle with the concept that this God was willing to have this sort of interaction and relationship, indeed make promises to some of these people. But actually, that is the very essence of sense, because God always had a purpose, as he said so many times in the Bible. And what is better, of course, moving on to other things, God has an ultimate purpose in which things will be perfect. And you then begin to realize just how many hints as well as clear statements there are as we read through the Bible on this score. If they weren't there, just think about this. If they weren't there, you'd think, well, yeah, that sort of makes sense, but it's what sort of bare bones. There's something missing. And what would be missing would be the reason. What would be missing would be the care of a creator who had deliberately done this. Let me just bring you to a single verse here and there in the Old Testament that help us, we hope, comprehend and appreciate this. If I can just find anything. God says in the 115th Psalm, even the heavens are the Lord's. So out there, that is God's domain. A man tries to pinprick into it and discover things and doesn't succeed very much. But the earth he has given to the children of men. Right? So God has drawn a clear divide in which he is in heaven and his human creation have got the earth. Now, that is particularly tackled in the part of the prophecy of Isaiah from chapter 40 onwards. And, well, actually, I could, had I brought my memory stick, have gone into a whole another 40 minutes of an analysis of the great things that God says in that part of Scripture. And what he does, and again, it's a logical appeal. It's a legalistic appeal because he pretends that he is in the courtroom being questioned by people who don't believe in it. I say, okay, all right, you go first. What are you going to say? What are your witnesses going to say in this situation? Well, I have witnesses. And his witnesses are his special people, the children of Abraham, the Jews, whose destiny is laid out for the scriptures and whose situation is clearly explained, and God's care for them proves that that is his purpose and he's working on it. But also that at the same time, God cares for his whole creation. And there's all sorts of references to nature and so on in this passage, in this set of chapters. Thus says the Lord, Isaiah 55:18, who created the heavens, who is God, who formed the earth and hath made it, who has established it, who did not create it in vain. He didn't make a mess of his plan. Who formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord, there is no other. I've not spoken in secret in a dark place of the earth. I didn't say to the seed of Jacob, oh, well, seek me in vain. I, the Lord, speak righteousness. I declare things that are right. God is quite clear of his position, and he knows that nobody can really answer that satisfactorily and claim any higher moral or logistical ground or logical ground. And the Apostle Paul carries on with this logical approach, this appeal to reason. He finds himself in the city of Athens, a center of learning which probably would not be equaled for many centuries, with some great schools of philosophy slugging it out with their ideas. And he comes in and he says some amazing things. He says of God, in explaining to them the one they thought they'd missed out, that he made the world and everything in it. He is Lord of heaven and earth, and that's a little dig to say, so you forget building a temple to him because he created everything. But the point is, he made heaven and earth, he's Lord of it, and then he doesn't need anything from us because he gives to everything life and breath and all things. You see, if God just did this and went away, that may not work. But God has put in place a proper system of sustaining of life and of making people think about him. How's he done this? He has and how he's controlled it. He has determined of all the peoples all over the earth, all the nations, he has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. So what man thinks he is doing by setting up kingdoms and conquests and empires and realigning the various allegiances that are in the world, no, God is at work. He has done all this. And why has he done it? Is he some detached sort of chess player messing around with the pieces of his creation? No. God has done this for a very good reason. That these people should seek the Lord in the hope that they might feel after and find him. But actually, he's not far from us, says Paul, because it's in him that we live and move, we have our being. And he quotes one of their famous poets from what is now a Greek island to back that up. Because there was this feeling that maybe we have to be somehow connected with a God. But it's not the sort of God you've got, where you put up altars, where you make great big gold and silver things for the God. No. That relates, says Paul, to a time of ignorance. Now, sadly, we also live in days of ignorance. People willingly ignore the evidence of a God who created with a purpose, who established a reason, who showed his plan, who developed it, and who, crucially, a totally different subject, sent his son to make sure that purpose would work. Now, that is relevant to Paul's argument, because, of course, he then goes on to say, well, how do we know this is so? Because God has raised this man from the dead. Whoa, that certainly brought some reaction. Now, you may say, well, that's a real outlier in terms of logic. But in terms of what the Bible teaches, the consistency and the beauty of the work of Jesus fitting into God's plan is truly beyond our comprehension and worth every bit of effort we put into it. Now, we could go on and on. But quite simply, if we find ourselves engaged in discussion with somebody of maybe not that particular Greek philosophical school or maybe not of a particular group of atheists who follow the latest Dawkinsy type thing, it doesn't matter. The fact is, what we have here in the Bible is a both, if you like, horizontally and vertically consistent and logical structure for understanding God, his purpose, and for faith, and a set of beliefs that bring that into focus and bring God's plan ever nearer. Why do I say that? Because God has said that those who are going to be saved will be saved. Now, there's no randomness about that. We look to the return of Jesus as the fulfillment of this plan, as the moment when God will have said, that's it. Now is the time to put everything right. But God doesn't make a mistake. And everybody who's meant to be in his kingdom will indeed be there. No ifs, no buts, no mistakes, no questions. Cast iron guarantee from our Creator. Thank you.